You can have all these symptoms of depression, but in our world, if you don't check that bottom box of no longer functioning, your therapist, your doctor, they're not going to think that there's an issue. They're going to say, well, come back when you break down. High functioning depression for me was a personal struggle. You're no longer enjoying things. You no longer find pleasure and interest in things. They don't light you up the way they used to. Then I realized that a lot of people are like me. On the outside, everything's put together. They look like they have a perfect life, but on the inside, they're struggling. They can't slow down. They're the rock. They're the one people depend on. They're the person that everyone goes to for help. They're overperforming because they're avoiding processing their pain. But the problem is that when you avoid processing and feeling your pain, you also push down your ability to feel joy.
That voice that rises that tells you, better be productive. You have been sitting down for too long. It tells you the worst part. Actually, you're lazy.
Are you a human being or are you a human doing?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. We're going to be real, raw, and authentic again. Today, I'm in New York, in Manhattan, sitting here. Today's episode is for anyone who feels like they're doing everything right on the outside, but they struggle deep down inside of themselves, often in silence. These invisible wounds that no one sees, but you experience. So, we're talking about something that many of us really struggle in silence, and that's high functional depression. So maybe you struggle with that and you look like successful on the outside, but feel empty on the inside, or disconnected, or just overwhelmed. Today I'm joined by Dr. Judith Joseph, a researcher, psychiatrist, and author. She just released her new book, High Functioning, is an expert on that very topic. I'm really excited to speak to her today. Thank you, Judith, for coming today. I'm so
Thank
happy.
you so much for having me.
This is so exciting. I've seen your content everywhere on social media. You have changed a lot of things for me personally also, because you have brought a lot of awareness to something, I have struggled with in the past, but I think so many people can relate. So first of all, I want to say thank you for taking the time in your busy schedule to be with me here today and to help you guys on your healing journey.
Well, thank you. I've followed you for a while and I really love your work. And the way that you speak about topics that are difficult, it's just so gentle that I feel that people feel as if, they can trust you. And thank you for supporting me and for coming out to my book launch.
Thank you. It was incredible. The book launch was amazing, and I'm really excited to read your book. And Judith, before we dive in, I'm very curious because you wrote the book, you're on social media, you're very popular, very famous in, let's say, our scene. And I would like to understand, what was your personal journey? How did you not just write the book, but what made you become an expert in the field of high functioning depression, trauma, in the mental health space?
Well, high functioning depression for me was a personal struggle. I remember in 2020, I was sitting at my desk in my lab and I was giving this talk to this very large hospital system, trying to help them to deal with all the uncertainty, right? And there were a lot of people who were nurses, doctors, and they were afraid. They didn't know what was going to happen. And halfway through that talk, I was sitting there and I'm like, oh my gosh, I think I'm depressed. Like it hit me. And I was feeling something called anhedonia, which is a medical term meaning you're no longer enjoying things. You no longer find pleasure and interest in things. They don't light you up the way they used to. You feel meh, bleh. And I thought, well, I study this and I'm an expert in depression and anhedonia. How did I let this sneak up on me? So at first, I felt like really ashamed. I was like, I should know better. Maybe it's something I did. But then I realized that like a lot of people are like me. On the outside, everything's put together. They look like they have a perfect life, but on the inside, they're struggling and they can't slow down. They're the rock. They're the one people depend on. They're the person that everyone goes to for help. So they've like really developed this identity and role as being the strong one, but they're really struggling. But they don't know how to slow down. They can't stop. So I wanted to research high functioning depression because you can have all these symptoms of depression. But in our world, and we know this, if you don't check that bottom box of no longer functioning or not in distress, your therapist, your doctor, they're not going to think that there's an issue. They're going to say, well, come back when you break down. And I thought that was a broken model that we should be helping people who are high functioning so that they don't break down, so that we prevent them from going through a crisis.
That's so profound. But when we're talking about high functioning depression and someone who has never heard of the term, what would you, how would you define it?
Well, in my lab, what I was seeing was people were coming in for depression studies. And we used this big Bible of psychiatry called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM for psychiatry. So when you check off the symptoms of depression, like poor sleep, poor concentration, problems with your appetite, not really enjoying social interactions, feeling guilt, hopelessness, low mood, anhedonia, not enjoying things. If you get down to the bottom and you don't check that box of low functioning, then you don't meet criteria. So you could essentially be checking all the boxes, but still over functioning, and no one will help you. And what I found in my research, because I published the first peer reviewed study in high functioning depression, I found that these people like me, they're busying themselves. They're overperforming because they're avoiding processing their pain. But the problem is that
Yeah.
when you avoid processing and feeling your pain, you also push down your ability to feel joy. And that's why we walk around meh, meh, numb,
Yeah.
right? And so if I can help people to recognize this, even if their healthcare professionals are not recognizing it, if I can help you to identify this in yourself, then I can also help you to reclaim your joy because joy is our birthright. We were born with the DNA to have joy. We all can make dopamine, but many of us feel as if joy is so out of reach, and I'm trying to help them to reclaim that.
Oh, that's beautiful. Is joy the same as happiness?
It's a great
Hmm.
question. I have my private practice and I have my research lab. And when people come to see me in private practice, the number one thing is, Dr. Judith, I just want to be happy. So then I'll ask them, what is happiness for you? And they'll say, well, it's when I get that great career, I finally get the house, or I finally have my life put together and I have like a family. That's happiness. So happiness is this idea, right? But joy in the research, is what we add up in terms of points of joy. So in psychiatry, I wish we could do like a blood test or scan your brain and say you have this or that, but we're just not there yet. So we use a lot of rating systems and scores to add up points of joy. For example, if you're tired and you take a nap, did you feel refreshed? That's a point. If you felt lonely and you reached out to a friend and you connected with them, did you feel a sense of, closeness? That's a point. If you're hungry and you're eating your food, did you savor it and enjoy it? Like, was your appetite there or not? Right? That's a point or not. So when you add up these points, and these are all sensations of what it is to be a human, because that's how we derive joy. That's what, becoming happier is. We add up those points. But in the real world, people don't know that. They're thinking happiness is this idea. And if you don't get that idea, if that thing doesn't happen, then you're holding your breath for happiness. But if you change your mindset and you're like, oh, I can get points of joy every day, that's within reach, that's attainable, and that's hopeful. So my patients, when they have that shift and they're like, oh my gosh, I've been thinking about this all wrong, right? Let me try and get as many points of joy in a day. So you may not get a point today, but there's always hope for tomorrow to at least get 1 or 2 points. And that can be a game changer for people who feel like they will never be happy.
When someone is, let's say, in that high functioning depression, what's the first thing if they come to you and they're like, I can identify myself with this? What would you say to them to exactly do this, let's say, small point scoring in a way? What's the thing that you say as a behavior? What can they do?
Well, the number one thing that they report to me is like, everything looks good on the outside. I have nothing to complain about. Why do I feel like this? Why do I feel meh, blah? And I say to them that, understand what's causing this. That there's three things that I've found in my research. It's unresolved trauma. So they're busying themselves, but know that one of the symptoms of trauma is low self worth, guilt, shame, blaming yourself. So when you do want to slow down, there's that trauma deep inside that says you're being lazy, right? It's like all or nothing thinking. Like if you slow down, it's equating to doing nothing. No,
Hmm.
slowing down is not the same as doing nothing, but there's that all or nothing thinking and that guilt if you were to slow down. Also, that internalizing the shame and blame makes you feel unworthy unless you're doing. So, a lot of us with high functioning depression, we tie our whole self worth to our roles. So, it's hard for us to be anything other than that rock, that person that shows up as an entrepreneur, the doctor that helps people. But you were someone before that role. So, know that. And then the second risk factor is anhedonia, that lack of pleasure and interest in things that once lit us up. And many of us have forgotten what we once loved, or we assume that we will no longer enjoy it. We've moved past that. So, a lot of the tools in my book are about how to tap into those past joys to see if they reignite that flame in us. And if they don't, how do we find new joys and interests? And then the third risk factor is people pleasing. Now,
Mm.
we're very familiar with the DSM, that Bible of psychiatry. There used to be a term in there called masochistic personality disorder, and it was removed in the 80s because it was thought to be a self blaming type of diagnosis or a victim blaming diagnosis. So people with masochistic personality disorder back then, they were thought to be people who brought on bad things to themselves, but they were also people who bent over backwards and people pleased. So, we don't want to throw away that whole term. It's a problematic term, but there are elements of it that are still being used today in a psychiatry office, right? They won't write it on your chart, but they'll say masochistic traits. So, bending over backwards for others when you're not really doing much for yourself. You're actually robbing yourself of joy by doing for others, or, overextending yourself or feeling unworthy of pleasure, right? So, you're basically robbing yourself of joy. So, those are three things that I've found. And many of us who are the rock, who are always there for others, at times we're giving, and we're not even thinking about ourselves. But when people are accustomed to taking, they're not going to reject you when you give, right? And so these are the types of behaviors I want people to recognize. And if people are listening and they're like, that's me, there is hope because once you recognize what's happening, then you can do something about it. And I spent a lot of time talking about why terms are important, right? Because if you imagine that you were in a dark room and there was a loud thud, some of us, if we couldn't see what it was, we'd start swinging, we'd start running, we'd scream. But if you turn that light on and you see what it is, then that in itself decreases the anxiety and the stress because now you know what you're working with. That's why knowing where these behaviors come from, how we ended up this way. That's why it's so powerful because then we know what we're dealing with and we can do something about
I love that. I love particularly the one with the dark room. That is
it.
so helpful because so many people struggle also with that helplessness, the not knowing, the feeling of like, well, they sometimes only know that way of feeling. It becomes also their personality, like you mentioned, the entrepreneur, to the constant overgiver or the let's say people pleaser who fixes everyone. How do we start identifying something beyond of what we know? Because our personality means also the way our thoughts are, our nervous system maybe responds is very familiar with something. So you mentioned also childhood trauma is how do we identify, hey, there is trauma or what's the root cause of it all?
It's really difficult for some people because one of the symptoms of trauma is forgetting. And in my book, I talk about how some of the patients that I've treated along the years, they don't even remember what happened. They're like, oh, my childhood is a blur. And when I
Yeah.
say to them, you realize that that could be related to trauma because your brain will push down the memories to protect you in that moment. But what happens over time is that if you don't process that, those moments of trauma will pop up in ways that you don't even recognize, right? They'll pop up in your sleep and you're like, why can't I get a good night's sleep? Or they'll pop up in body pain. I talk about cases where there are people who ended up in the hospital with these, what seemed like physical symptoms related to a medical condition, but they were related to unresolved past trauma. And it shows up in behaviors as well. And I often say to my clients who are like this, a nice way to know whether or not where you are on your high functioning healing journey is to ask yourself in that moment, are you a human being or are you a human doing? Because if you find yourself busying yourself, that could be related to that fight or flight, right? Like that sense that
Mm.
you can't slow down. And so there are tools in there to help you slow down, tools to ground you back into your body again, because many times we just don't even know where the day went, right? We're back to back in meetings, we're invalidating our bodies. We're not even listening to our bladder when our bladder is like, get up and go pee, go
Yeah.
urinate. We're just boom, boom, doing, doing, doing. Before you know it, it's 6 p.m. and we haven't even gone to the bathroom, right? So there are tools in there to start listening to your body again, because when you are in fight or flight and you're busying yourself to avoid dealing with things, you invalidate so many parts of you. And that's why the first step truly is validation, accepting and acknowledging how you feel, good or bad, and start to listen to yourself again.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's so wonderful how you put this. I had something that you said in one of your reels. You've mentioned it also before, but for people who did not listen and also did not see the reel, it was about coffee drinking that I personally could relate so much. I was like, wow, this was me. Maybe also 10 years ago, I was drinking coffee almost drinking from the morning to the evening. I could drink coffee even at night. It didn't matter to me. My sleep was always bad because of hypervigilance anyway. Any light would bother me. I would wake up in the middle of the night. So coffee actually also helped me to get through the day, despite the fact that I sometimes skipped and also meals on top of it. Is this a sign, or is this something that maybe I would have struggled with, like high functioning depression? Because I felt like I kept on working 18-hour shifts in a hospital and so on and so forth just to keep going, and I've dedicated a lot to my work. Is that hyper functioning depression?
I see that a lot in my folks who I work with who are high functioning, and a lot of healthcare professionals, those who have to show up for others, they use coffee to fuel themselves. They are pathologically productive. They can't slow down. They're the rock. This is their identity. And also, this can be part of the whole cultural behavior of an
Hmm.
institution. If everyone around you is the rock for the patient, the important, healthcare professional who has to be there no matter what. And you see it in hospitals, right? Everyone is running on coffee. You'll see it when go to any busy hospital cafeteria. You'll see people eating their food, shoving it in, running,
Yeah,
doing something else. They're not
true.
even tasting the food. It's just fuel to keep going. And one of the things I talk about is like literally sitting with your meal and being intentional and present in it and practicing the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method, where you're being really intentional about looking at what you're eating and observing the sounds it makes as you chew it and tasting all the flavors, as you eat it and smelling the scents, and really getting into it. You're using all five senses to be present, because it may sound so like, basic, but what you're doing is you're grounding yourself in a moment and saying, I am a human being. I'm worthy of enjoying a nourishing meal, because I don't have to always be on the go. I don't have to always be the rock. I can actually enjoy this point of joy. I'm worthy of this point. And, I joke because I treat very small children, and then I work with elders.
Hmm.
The small ones are very busy. They have ADHD. A lot of times the elders, dementia. And I have the teenagers and the adults in my office as well. And we have food. And I love to observe them eating, because you see the little kids and they're like, they're enjoying their snacks.
Yeah.
And you see the elders and they're like, mm. But then you see the teens and the adults and they're like on their phone, answering a call. It's
Yeah.
like we forget the basic joys in life. We're leaving so many points on the table, and you can snatch up little points in a day. For example, when I get my daughter to school on time, like I did this morning, I literally will sit in my living room and drink my coffee. And that's the one thing everyone knows, let her drink her coffee in peace. And I'll only have one cup, but I taste it and I savor it, because it's my moment of saying, I did this thing today. I didn't have to get her to school on time. I didn't have to be a busy working mom, but I did it and let me enjoy this moment of peace for me. And it's one thing that I try to do every day to show myself that I'm worthy of that moment to reflect and say, I did that. And we don't do that. As busy professionals, we go from one meeting to the next, to the next. And before you know it, we haven't eaten, we haven't gone to the bathroom, we've been
True.
chugging our coffee,
Yeah.
and we're depleting ourselves of basic points of joy.
That's so true. And a lot of times, what I notice is the beginning of it all is the hardest. And maybe you've seen it also in a lot of people that you've worked with, because the body feels very restless. I guess it's the nervous system wanting and telling you also through thoughts, get up, do something. It's a harsh inner critic, that voice that rises that tells you, well, better be productive. You have been sitting down for too long. There's nothing, you're not gaining anything, or it tells you the worst part. Actually, you're lazy. If you don't do this, you will maybe not be loved or acknowledged, or it goes in extremes. You're
Yes.
losing your job. You will not perform as well, or people will not like you as much if you don't continue to show up and please them. So
Yeah.
the beginning of it all is very challenging. But what would you say to them, roughly based on also maybe your research, if you're okay giving it away a little bit, but creating a bit of hope for people that are out there that can relate? How long does it take to do these wonderful practices that you share also in your book? Like that we start seeing a noticeable maybe shift, not an entire change or transformation, but a noticeable shift that I can sit a little bit longer, that I can savor this moment.
The hopeful thing about this is that you can start getting your points today, right? And that's why I love the points of joy, because
Love that.
you don't have to
Yeah.
do radical things. Acknowledge that one point if you're able to. Acknowledge that one point if you want to slow down and you don't know how to. Give yourself 5 minutes to just say, I'm just not going to check my phone, not going to, think about another thing that I have to do. That 5 minutes will be when I do this one thing, which is nothing, intentional resting. And there you go. You've got one point. And, the fight or flight is so real. I experienced it personally when I first moved to this country from the Caribbean. We had very little. And I never processed that scarcity trauma, right? I
Mm.
just kept going and going. Be the perfect student, get into a good school, be the first doctor in your family. But then it doesn't stop there. If you don't process that trauma, it keeps going. Then it's never enough. Okay, then you have to get this job. Then you have to start a lab. Then you have to make sure you have X amount of money. And then it's the goalpost, that happy, it keeps moving. It's always something it's never enough. And if I didn't stop and recognize that, I would have run myself down ragged. That fight or flight says, keep on working, keep doing, don't stop, you'll run out. And it's irrational, but we listen to it because it's in our bodies. So we have to start with the basic and learn how to slow down physiologically and ground ourselves and soothe ourselves, because when the brain is stressed, it makes terrible decisions. When the brain is
Oh,
stressed, it
yeah.
says, eat those fries, eat that processed food, drink that coffee, doom scroll, right? Because you're in fight or flight and you don't know how to slow down. So start with the very basics. Get one point, then get two, and build it from there.
Is an ideal point score for the day, actually?
Just one more point than yesterday if you can.
Yeah,
And
okay.
if not, just any points, right? Because one point is better than 0 points. So try to get your joy as best as possible.
And what you mentioned also was the anxiety basically keeps on going to the next thing, to the next thing that you experience sort of in your body, and your mind then presents you with a sort of a narrative of
Yes.
way of thinking.
Yes. Your mind will tell you, okay, you're being lazy. You're going to run out. It's not enough. And what happens with that mind body connection is that then your body reacts by putting you into fight or flight. So you're restless. One of the symptoms of depression that people often ignore is that restlessness. So I'll ask my clients, when you're not busy, how do you feel? And they're like, restless. How do you feel if you're not working? Empty.
Hmm.
So instead of addressing it, they fill it up with more work.
Yeah.
And then over time, that's how your body is learning how to soothe. And that's why we get neglected by the healthcare system, because we're over functioning. We're doing so much. But over time, that is going to lead to either your body breaking down, you soothing, in unhealthy ways by maybe using too many substances
Mm.
or busying yourself with buying too much. Like you see this with the people buying so much and they don't know how to stop shopping. Or you do dip into low functioning depression. You do eventually stop being able to function. You have an emotional and psychological breakdown. So something's going to give. Recognize these signs early. Let's not wait. You don't see cancer doctors saying, let's wait till it gets to stage 4, then we'll do something. No, they're saying catch it before cancer even starts. You don't hear people saying, when you have a heart attack, then coming. No, let's prevent heart disease. Why are we waiting for people to break down? Why?
Good point,
Why are we in
actually.
the
Yeah,
dark
why are you
ages?
waiting?
Let's show people how to recognize these signs. Let's show them what anhedonia is. Let's show them the symptoms of depression. Let's help them understand why they can't slow down so that we prevent this mental and physical breakdown from ever happening.
So when I experience anhedonia, am I already in a form of depression, or is this one of the early stage signs?
It's one of the signs, actually, of a lot of different conditions. Anhedonia can be a hallmark for depression. Anhedonia could be a hallmark for trauma, for substance use. It's not a condition in itself, it's a symptom.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing about anhedonia is that most people don't know what it is. Like in research, we see anhedonia all over the rating scales, but most people don't have never heard of it. They're like, anho what?
Yeah.
So it's really important to use socials, right? That's why having a lab and then putting that content out there based on the research is so powerful because it's bridging that gap between the research world and the real world. So people can actually say, I know what this is when they go to their therapist. I have anhedonia. Can you please help me? Because this lack of joy, it may not look like a crisis, but it could be the indication that something bigger is happening. And I want to prevent that from happening.
Sometimes people even say, snap out of it. Why
Yes.
don't you enjoy it? You're now, let's say, on holidays. A lot of times people get almost even pushed. It's a bit also maybe society, like, why are you not enjoying this? What would you say to people who are maybe not fully aware that their friend, their family member is experiencing anhedonia?
You know, a lot of times us who experience this, we feel guilty. Remember that unresolved trauma? We
Mm.
blame ourselves like, why can't I enjoy this? What's wrong with me?
Mm-hmm.
Why am I ungrateful? I want you to know that it is not your fault, and I think that's important
Mm-hmm. I
because
like
one of
that.
the things after experiencing trauma is, especially with children that we work with who have trauma,
Oh.
number one is you tell them it's not their fault. So if someone is experiencing this, make sure you tell them it's not their fault. They need to hear that because they're internalizing that blame and they feel like guilty. Number two is that you remove them from whatever it is that's stressing them out. So if this person feels like they have to be the person that everyone depends on, let them know it's okay that you want to help them, right? And they're not going to ask you because they're internalizing this blame and shame. So just show up. You don't have to do, just sit there with them. You don't have to be this rock for everyone. I just want to be with you, and they may not accept that here, but
Mm-hmm.
on a deeper level, you being there, even when they're not providing, it's showing them that they are enough, right?
So it's giving safety.
It is.
Oh, that's nice. I like that.
And radically accepting them, because they need to know that you are there no matter what. They don't have to do because these are people who feel like they can't slow down. That's why we hear these stories of people who, lost hope and we're like,
Mm.
but they look so happy. We had no idea. They never wanted to tell you that they were struggling because they felt guilty. They felt like they did something wrong, that it's their fault. Why aren't they happy?
Yeah, that guilt and shame
Mm-hmm.
is very deep.
Mm-hmm.
So if I go into, let's say, this early symptoms or signs of that high functioning depression, how do I identify that? Where would I, let's say, need to put another pause button, but just that awareness of, oh, this is me, I'm struggling with this. What are there certain, let's say, criteria, points that I
There
could
are.
identify? Can you name a few?
Yes. Well, they're on my website in my high functioning depression quiz. But one of the ones is nothing I do is ever enough, right?
Mm.
I may be
Oh,
the
good.
most
Yeah.
productive person, but it's not enough, right? That's that guilt. Another one is when I sit still, I just feel so restless. I have to keep going. I have to keep going. And then there's the anhedonia quiz that tells you how high or low your anhedonia is. But the other symptoms are the symptoms of depression, like or it changes in your sleep, appetite, not feeling like food is as tasty as it
Mm-hmm.
used to be, not enjoying intimacy the way you did. You just can't wait to get it over with. The basic joys in life, they're just not doing it for you, not feeling rested after you take a nap or you sleep for the night, not feeling the energy. but you're still going on empty. These are all the symptoms, but you're still functioning and you're over functioning. So you have these symptoms of depression, but you're not meeting that criteria because you
Yeah.
are still showing up. And so you're not going to get
Oh,
the support.
this is so helpful. So if you can relate to this, then really go and get Dr. Judith's book because she has a lot of solutions in there how you can help yourself. I have another question because depression, you mentioned also the high functioning depression or mental health struggles in general often go into, let's say, trauma. And a lot of people say, like, oh, I didn't have trauma,
Yeah.
I didn't have the car accident or something like this. Can trauma be also something else that's not just, let's say, the car accident, the obvious things? Can that be also something maybe in childhood or even later in life that's different?
Yes. And I do have a more expanded trauma inventory because in my research with PTSD, we use the CAPS-5 and the diagnostic criteria that's used for combat veterans because a lot of the research in the US is for PTSD is based out of the Veterans
Yeah.
Hospital. But when you use that diagnostic criteria, the traumas have to be either like life threatening or like very violent or assaults that you either experienced or you witnessed.
Hmm.
So if someone comes to you and they say, I went through this very difficult, emotionally traumatic divorce and they took me for everything I had and I didn't have any friends and you know, didn't have money and so forth. We would have to, using that very strict, rigid criteria for the DSM-5, we'd say that doesn't count. And imagine how
Mm.
invalidating that is
Yeah.
for someone who was in fight or flight because they just didn't have any food. They just were like literally didn't know whether or not they would be able to have a place to sleep, right? So what we do in our lab is we have a separate inventory where we say, we see you. Your traumas may not meet criteria for being like life threatening or assault or anything like that, but we know that they have shaped you emotionally and psychologically and shaped the way that you interact in the world and how you see yourself in the world. So we're going to classify that as a little t trauma. And other researchers have done this too, because, imagine someone coming to you and telling you something very painful that happened to them, but you're like, well, that doesn't count as a trauma here.
Yeah.
So we have this expansive trauma inventory so people can uncover things that have been emotionally painful, that have shaped them and how they see themselves in the world, how they interact in the world. And we include those traumas. The other thing I hear often is, well, how is this different than burnout? And what I tell them is that, okay, burnout was only recently added to the DSM only a couple of
Yeah.
years ago. But none of us would say it didn't exist before that. Therapists were not waiting for it to be classified. We
No.
were seeing it and treating
Exactly.
it
Yeah.
early on. Well, burnout is an occupational condition. So
Hmm.
technically, it's the workplace that's doing it. What we see in functioning folks is that even when they're out of the workplace, they can't relax. They're doing things like they're taking on their kids' sports, they're helping a friend with a project. They just can't sit still. So it's not the occupational hazard, it's not the outside environment, it's something within them
Hmm.
that's driving them to be over functioning, to not be able to sit still. They're busying themselves, they don't know why. And that's what makes it different. It's irrespective of their work environment. So I want people to understand, what is it in your past? What is it that's unresolved where you feel like you can't slow down, where you feel guilty if you take a break, where you blame yourself for your current situation? What is that? Let's unpack that. Let's process it and let's help you to heal so you can reclaim your joy.
I like it. That's so much deeper. When people, let's say, can relate to this, what you just said, what's the one thing you would say if they can, if you can send them a message of like, this is the first step that you maybe can be doing now, or the active thing, practice to identify if something is in your past, or if you have to help yourself a little bit, what would you advise them? What would you say to them?
I always ask people to look at their hand, like most of us have 5 fingers,
Yeah.
but just look at your hand and say to yourself, I have the DNA, I was built with the DNA for joy. Everyone has it. And joy is my birthright. And let me use one of these 5 things. I have a 5V methodology in my book. Let me tap into one of these 5 things every
Mm.
day and reclaim my joy, right? And so I think it's powerful because there is only one you and there's only one me ever in the future
So
or the
true.
history of the university of the universe. Um, ever. There will only be one you or one me
Hmm.
in the history and the future of the universe. So let's understand the science of your happiness. Let's help you tap into your joy. And I think a lot of people, what they do is they read a book, they'll listen to a podcast, they'll look at a meme, and they're like, "Why is this not working for me?"
Hmm.
Well, because you didn't understand the science of your happiness, right? There's only one you. Why are you using things that work for others and you don't even understand yourself? So in my book, I will give you tools to understand the science of what's making you unhappy.
Good.
How do you
Yeah.
understand the science of your happiness if you don't even identify the things in your life that are pulling away from your happiness? And there is this tool, the biopsychosocial model, that
Hmm.
all medical students learn. And I want people to understand their own biopsychosocials so that they understand what biologically is making you unhappy from a physical perspective. Is it a medical condition? Is it a family history of something? What psychologically is pulling your joy? Is it trauma? Is it your attachment style? What socially is pulling away from your joy? Is it who you're partnered with? Is it your job? Is it what you're eating and
Hmm.
the habits you're engaged in? And once you can map out your biopsychosocial, because we all have a unique one, like we all have a unique fingerprint, then you understand the areas of your life that are draining your joy points. So you know how to replenish those areas so that you can reclaim your joy.
So basically, what you're describing is your book is almost a training. So retrain your nervous system and your brain also with neuroplasticity,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
That's brilliant. I like that. And for anyone who's like, okay, I'm gonna start now. I'm gonna first of all get your book and read it, but then I want to do the work. How long do we have to keep at it so that we notice, like, okay, it's changing, it's working? Is there research wise a sort of indicator, 6 months, 12 months, something that where I notice, okay, I'm making these small but profound life changes that help me inside maybe heal, if that's the word.
Well, I always say don't do all fives at once. A lot of us want to
Yeah.
do everything at once.
Yeah.
Pick one or two and tap into it today. It could be that one point of, I'm going to sit and eat a meal and really be present in it. That's a point. So I think you can start increasing your points of joy right away. And, don't be discouraged if over time, things aren't looking drastically different. We're shifting your mindset. We're not trying to be happy, we're trying to be happier. So do it slowly. And there are different tools in there depending on people's needs. But I wanted to make sure that I democratize this information and make it available because in some parts of the US, there's
Mm.
only one psychiatrist for 30,000 people. So, like, have these tools. Why are we keeping them to ourselves? Let's help people to identify this so that they can get the support that they need.
That's great. I think you're making this possible beyond the United States because the problem we face, you will work both in systems around the world basically, and the availability for psychiatrists, psychologists is very limited. And having a book like yours is such a helpful tool for everyone who is in need and wants to make changes, and ideally today, starting their journey, not waiting for 6 to 12 months to see someone. So I'm very grateful, and I speak for everyone who is listening and watching. Thank you for writing this incredible book, putting your heart and soul into it. It's wonderful. Before I let you go, I always ask every guest on my podcast, if you could travel back in time, it could be anywhere, could be yesterday, could be in your childhood. What would you say to yourself? What advice would you give?
Well, I used to get these really excruciating headaches in the middle of the night
Mm.
when I was a child. And it was, now that I reflect on it, it was out of worrying. Like, well, are we going to be able to pay our bills? Am I going to be able to go to college? Just worries, worries,
Mm.
worries. I would go back in time and I would just tell that little girl, like, you know what? You are enough. You don't have to be the perfect student. You don't have to get straight A's. You don't have to worry about the whole family. You are enough. Because I think I missed out on so many points of joy in my childhood because of those worries. And even then, I was this busy, 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 busy kid, always doing, not slowing down and not processing pain and pushing down that pain really it disabled my ability to access joy. So I would tell her that you are enough.
I think that's such an important message for not just your little self, but for a lot of people out there, that collecting points, or points of joy, actually doesn't make you lazy. It doesn't make you less successful. I think that's a worry that a lot of people live with. If I stop doing what I'm doing or prioritize myself a little bit, that they miss out on that success or that next paycheck. And I think your message is no, it's not. You can have it both. That's a wonderful message. Thank you so much for being on my podcast today. I really appreciate it that you made the time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Please make sure that you get her book. It's gonna be your tool set that helps you to make your life better, and hopefully that you feel much more joy and happiness in your life after you read the book and integrated the tools and practical things. I am excited to read it. And if you loved this episode, it would really mean so much to me if you could hit that subscribe button, because it's truly the easiest way to support me and my podcast so that I can help create much more content, bring in wonderful guests that help you on your healing journey. But for now, please remember to take good care of yourself. I'll see you in the next episode. And maybe you want to mention in the comments what was your takeaway from today's episode.